Good afternoon and welcome to the Acton Institute. We're absolutely delighted you're here for our September Acton lecture series. Thank you to those of you who are online and live streaming today with us. We're delighted you're sharing this time with us as well. On behalf of our benefactors and those who make this possible, those who fund these events, volunteer and put their work in those in our program team, thank you again for all of your work. And it's a delight to be here. My name is Dan Churchwell, and we're glad you're joining us. We have a really phenomenal speaker today. The format will be about 40 minutes of lecture and then 20 minutes of Q&A. So be thinking of your questions, writing those down. We will have two people with microphones, and we will get those microphones to you so you can ask your questions. Let me introduce our speaker for today. It's an absolute pleasure to have Leah Kroll, the Senior Director of Strategy and Innovation at the Mercatus Center. She's an expert facilitator and author who helps nonprofits doing the hard work of building civil society to innovate and be more effective. Her brand new book, Innovation for Social Change: How Wildly Successful Nonprofits Inspire and Deliver Results, is for sale back here, and they've been autographed. So if you like the talk and would like a book, please pick one of those up at the end of the event. She currently is the Senior Director of Strategy and Innovation at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University, the home of heterodox thinkers and economists who work to discover what aspects of institutions and culture help societies to prosper. She is a sought-after speaker at nonprofit industry events, and she writes frequently about her research and offers tailored consulting to nonprofit teams and provides coaching to social entrepreneurs across the country. She has a passion for helping organizations achieve their mission and is an active volunteer in her own community and parish. She holds a master's degree in public policy from Duquesne University and is a returned Peace Corps volunteer from Jamaica from 2002 to 2004. If you'd like to know more about Leah, please visit her website at leahkroll.com. Please give an Acton welcome to Leah Kroll.
Well, thank you, Dan, for that really kind introduction, and thank you to the Acton Institute for graciously inviting me here today to talk about my new book. So let me just start by sharing a little bit about my story. So going on about 20 years now, I've been working at this exciting organization just outside of Washington, D.C. called the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. And it's been around for about 40 years. We have a staff of about 200 people. And as Dan mentioned, I like to describe it as the home of brainy economists who work to discover what aspects of institutions and culture help societies prosper. Mercatus is actually the Latin word for markets. And it's all really, our heart and soul is really all about economics. For example, how would you advise a city council or mayor about stadium subsidies? Another team has recently started working on this question of, in a time of deep polarization in our country, how can markets work properly if there's a breakdown in social trust and civil discourse, and what can we do about it? So Kevin Augustine here at Acton actually was working with us on that project. So I've had the good fortune to work at this very, kind of like Acton, like a really creative place, lots of interesting ideas, cool hallway conversations. And I've also had the good fortune to have this sort of unique, interesting role there. So I serve as an internal consultant, and I work alongside our 30 or so different program teams to help them ask this question of, how do we know if what we're doing is working? That can be a hard question in the nonprofit space. And how can we ensure that we're strategic, accountable, and effective to our stakeholders and to ourselves and to our mission? So my role involves a lot of kind of creative whiteboarding sessions with program teams and workshops on things like theory of change or how do we measure success. So I've just been kind of happily doing that work quietly in the background. And about 3 or so years ago, my executive director knocked on my door one day at Mercatus, and he was like, "Hey, Leah, I've been hearing all these good things about these workshops you're doing with the teams. Why don't you put it into book form?" And I thought that is a really cool opportunity. And so I think my response was something like, let me think about it, yes. So I set to work, so I had like 20 years worth of these PowerPoints that I had been doing, so I wanted to start converting those into some book form, chapter format. And so then the pandemic happened right around that time. And so that actually gave me kind of the quiet space to start interviewing people, gathering more stories from other, wider variety of nonprofits in addition to my Mercatus stories and examples. And I found all sorts of great stories from places like Mayo Clinic, Habitat for Humanity, Alcoholics Anonymous, Fred Rogers' nonprofit production company. So I was working on building all those stories into the book. And I was looking for successes and failures, and I wanted to write a very practical book, not abstract, but something that would make sense for really busy nonprofit practitioners and be a help to them, just like the same way that I help Mercatus teams. And so all in all, I probably spent maybe somewhere between 2 and 3 hours a day, because I had my day job, 2 to 3 hours a day doing this research, and then for about 2.5 years to research the book. So I'm really happy to share it with you today. So why nonprofits? Why do they matter? Why should we care? So if you think about it, nonprofits provide some of the greatest gifts to the world and take on some of its hardest problems. Nonprofits are building civil society. Think of the important work of Acton right here that argues for a moral foundation to the market economy and promotes interreligious dialogue. It's very important work. Just yesterday, I got a tour of Family Promise of West Michigan, just down the road, that's doing wonderful work. And it's important, this work of nonprofits. Our work eases hunger, fights injustice. Nonprofits that advance education help break the chains of ignorance and poverty. Recovery programs, mental health counseling, medical care and research provide healing. Arts programs lift the human spirit. So I'm betting that a nonprofit has touched your life or the life of someone you care about. And I suspect we have a lot of nonprofit practitioners here today with a lot of passion for what you do. So we know that there's so many people who are counting on our work, but think about what it means if a nonprofit provides mediocre services to an at-risk young person. I've seen it. The stakes are high. So good intentions aren't going to automatically translate into impact or outcomes. And so this brings us to a question. Why do some nonprofits punch above their weight while others misfire? Why is that? We need organizations that empower us to ask courageous questions and innovate and experiment to discover what works. So that brings us to the book. There we go. So what do we mean by innovation, and what gets in the way? So I think about innovation simply as finding new and better ways of doing things. It can be big or it can be small. So if we think about big innovation in the nonprofit or philanthropy world, it could be something like the civil rights movement, this huge innovation, social change. It could be something like the interesting story about the creation of the 911 emergency phone system, which actually, one time didn't exist, and it took a lot of stakeholders coming together from philanthropy and nonprofits to make that happen. It's a cool story, but that's big, right? That's kind of nationwide. So there's big innovations like that, like maybe the things the X Prize Foundation works on. But the innovation can also be quite small and humble, and I would argue that that matters too. And it could be as simple as, say you work at a nonprofit where you have sort of an intake of information process. Someone comes to your front desk and people are like manually entering it on, writing it on paper, and then it's got to be entered into a database. And then someone comes up with the idea of, well, let's just switch over to an iPad, right? And now your information is going directly. That's very small, right? Very humble change. But now that time and money can be put to better use elsewhere. So I would argue that both of those types of innovation matter. We want to see that happen in our organizations. We want to encourage that. But then what gets in the way? And so I think it's important to be honest about the messy realities of the nonprofit workplace. Because there's no doubt we all have passion and heart. We care about our mission. We care about the people we're serving. But if passion isn't the problem, then what is? So first, there's this sort of, well, let me show you. When I ask this question of people when I give workshops with our teams, we get some interesting responses. So see if any of this looks familiar. So, there's one of the challenges might be, bureaucracy. That's every workplace, whether it's a nonprofit or for-profit, right? We have that. But in the nonprofit world, there can be this challenge of, there's sort of a fog, right? So we might have good intentions, but how do we translate that into action and clarity? How do we know what to do? There's this wonderful quote by Stephen Covey of, we might be climbing up the rungs of the ladder, but is the ladder leaning against the right wall in the first place? And I think that's a great question that we all wrestle with in the nonprofit world. And people get worn out, spread too thin, right? A lot of nonprofits, you see compassion fatigue, where people are just struggling to prioritize and confidently say no to things. There's so many things we want to do. And with that then comes this misguided thinking that we don't have time to be strategic. And then another challenge can just be misguided metrics that bog us down when we could be spending that time elsewhere. And workplace culture matters a lot too, right? There might be fear to speak up. How do we challenge the status quo? So failing to empower people on the front lines, the people actually doing the work, they're going to be the ones with the best ideas. And so then when I'm asking these questions, I also like to ask teams, now tell me about your donor-grantee relationship. Can that sometimes lead to challenges when it comes to innovation? And of course, the answer is yes. I want to be fair about this. Like it's a two-way relationship, right? And just like any relationship, any human relationship, there can be foibles, right? We're people. And so sometimes the problem is on the grantee side. Sometimes the problem might be on the side of philanthropy, right? So maybe both parties are talking past each other. Or maybe one party is unaccountable. Or maybe one party has a short attention span or is imposing bureaucratic metrics. So it can be two ways, but the reason why I bring this up is it's guaranteed to trickle down into how your workplace operates in a nonprofit if there are some of these kind of pathologies going on. So then the question is, now that we're being honest about these challenges of things that get in the way of innovation, but what can we do about it? And that's a lot of what my book is about. So I'm a believer in stealing good ideas wherever you see them. So we're all familiar with Pixar. Pixar's movies have won 23 Academy Awards and are some of the highest grossing animated films of all time. Movies like Toy Story. So what's the secret to their success? At Pixar, teams are expected to give what they call brutal feedback to each other. A Pixar executive will say that they assume early on, and this is going to sound a little harsh, but this is what the executive said. Early on, we assume that all of our movies suck, and the job of the creative feedback process is to get the movie from suck to unsuck. Now that's a bit shocking, right? That sounds pretty harsh. But the same executive explained that, importantly, everyone in the room at Pixar knows that the questions raised must be in the spirit of making the creative product as good as it can possibly be. So without that manager sort of setting the tone as a safe space, that kind of tough love feedback process would never get off the ground. So how do they do this? They use a creative process called design thinking. And this design thinking process is used by many marketing and design firms. It's been around for decades. But there's some parallels, I think, to designing a great movie and designing nonprofit programs and interventions. And so what would it look like then if we translate design thinking to our own use in nonprofits? So this is the first section of my book. So design thinking is a process for exploring what's possible and thinking creatively and strategically. So with design thinking, we end up asking ourselves, and this is kind of the Leah version of design thinking. I kind of looked at how they were using it in the for-profit world and then tested it out with our own teams until it felt right for what it might look like for a nonprofit. So there's kind of an ideating part, and then there's definitely an action part. So with the ideating part, we ask ourselves 3 questions. What's desirable? What's feasible? And what's scalable? I'll explain each of these with some examples. So that's kind of the thinking part, right? And then we get to, well, based on all that thinking, then how would we design some small experiments? So asking what's desirable, this is a challenge for us in nonprofits. It's actually really hard work. So what is the problem we're trying to solve? Are we good at identifying hidden needs? And I like this one quote from Henry Ford. He said something like, if I would have asked my customers what they wanted, they would have said a faster horse. So our beneficiaries aren't just going to walk right up to us and just hand it to us, right? We have to do the work of figuring it out. What is the thing we're trying to do? And this is so important. Basically, everything starts from that, right? Having a clear vision, a clear understanding of the problem we want to solve, because everything we do then cascades from that. So just for example, let's say that you work at a nonprofit that focuses on workforce development. What aspect of workforce development are you trying to solve? Are you focused on those who are temporarily unemployed and will probably readily find their way back to the workforce with just a little bit of help? Or are you focused on the chronically unemployed or underemployed? Totally different problem. So I'd like to share an example of a nonprofit that was thinking through those questions. So Greystone Bakery is a very interesting nonprofit workforce development program in Yonkers, New York. And the team at Greystone Bakery wanted to take on some of those hardest cases of the chronically unemployed or underemployed. And so they set about to work really hard to understand, well, what are the specific problems? What is it that we're trying to solve? And so really interesting story. Their founder is actually an aeronautics engineer, super brainy guy, and very passionate, though, about his neighborhood and this mission. So he actually did kind of a wild and crazy thing of actually living on the street as a homeless person for a few weeks. What he wanted to do was he wanted to better understand the clients that they were trying to serve. He wanted to walk in their shoes. And what he learned from these immersion experiences was really quite powerful. So based on what they learned, based on these experiences, their team set to work incorporating lessons from those direct observations to inform every detail of their highly unusual and innovative business model. So, for example, they created an apprenticeship program that was open to absolutely anyone. So the bakery has a first come, first serve waiting list for a position, and no background checks and no interviews are conducted. An on-site social worker helps employees solve obstacles such as stress management, transportation, childcare, subsidized housing, and referrals for drug rehabilitation. Sometimes fights break out. 4 out of 5 workers can be gone within a week or two, but they can always sign up again. So everyone gets a chance at Greystone Bakery, and some succeed. Greystone's model is a success in its field, providing the dignity of work to those highest risk hires who were previously thought unemployable. So by asking themselves those hard questions, what's desirable, this helped them find clarity about their why and their how. And it's so important to be clear about our assumptions and our why, because everything cascades from that then as we design our programs. So then the question of what's scalable. So the civil rights movement, there's so much that we can learn from the civil rights movement. They started very small. If you've read about that movement and that time in history, they started very small, very humbly, just a few dedicated leaders and a few volunteers, no resources really. And they took huge risks. They were strategic, and through trial and error, they eventually learned how to scale to a national movement. And looking at a number of case studies like the civil rights movement, what I found is that a nonprofit's limited size and budget is never a constraint to achieving widespread social change and setting the world ablaze. Most nonprofits start with nothing more than like a spark of an idea and a few passionate volunteers. So how do they do this? If you were to break that apart and kind of look at the model or maybe some lessons that you could pull out from these organizations, I have a chapter on that. But I'll just, in the interest of time, I'll just share one. So one lesson is about finding partners and building coalitions if we're thinking about how to scale. So the civil rights movement was able to bring together a very broad, very diverse coalition of partners that did not see eye to eye on everything as they worked together. And I saw that time and time again. So partners can end up being unlikely or completely unexpected. They might even be from opposite sides of the political spectrum. And we're seeing this now. There's a lot of groups working together on criminal justice reform that do not see eye to eye at all on the political spectrum, but they're working together on a common issue. So chapter 3 in the book is called Stretching the Imagination, and it shares techniques and real-world stories to help you and your team think through how your organization might go about scaling. So then we get to what's feasible. So sometimes in nonprofits, we all like each other a lot. We like working together. Maybe we're very highly collaborative. We all believe in our mission. We like our colleagues. So that at times can lead us to be maybe a little bit shy and too polite with each other. And we don't want to hurt each other's feelings. So we have this saying at Mercatus, that our teams will say it a lot, that we want to ask ourselves the hard questions so that our board and donors don't have to. And this takes courage. It's not hard, right? We might really like our colleagues down the hall, and it's hard to ask these what's feasible questions. But we must, right? Because nonprofits have limited resources, and of course we want our resources to be applied to their highest and best use. Even though there are so many problems we want to tackle, right, we have to narrow in focus. We can't say yes to everything. And we also have to watch out for groundless optimism. We have to be realistic. So the chapter in the book on what's feasible shares examples for encouraging teams to ask hard questions like these. One of them is kind of fun. I've hinted at it here a little bit, but if anyone's seen the movie The Devil Wears Prada, where Meryl Streep plays this kind of role as a tough-of-nails editor of Vogue, she's kind of fierce and intimidating. The character is Miranda Priestley. And so what we do in this role-playing exercise is I'll take that picture, kind of blow it up, tape it on a wall, and then bring a team in. And I'll explain, like, we're about to do a role-playing exercise. So the leader of the team, Ben, he's going to go ask her for $3 million. So we pretend that she's the head of like a family foundation. And so he's got to go make an ask of her. And so the team's role now is to help Ben get ready for this intense meeting. And so our role is, let's start imagining, we know she has this reputation for being pretty tough. So can we imagine some of those tough questions she's going to ask Ben? And then can we help him get ready with the answers to those questions? And these are the ideas that they surface. I mean, these are tough questions, right? And these are normally like very shy, polite people. So I was really proud of, I think they really enjoyed this exercise. But these are the types of kind of skeptic questions or what's feasible questions that we need to be thinking about. So you can kind of see in design thinking how these sort of work together. So when we ask what's desirable or what's scalable, it's just the sky's the limit, right? We're being very creative. We're not shooting any ideas down, and that's important. But at some point, we have to come back down to earth and ask those tough questions. So then we've done these fun kind of ideating exercises with our teams. And the way the book is structured, you can do these with a team, but you can also just treat it as sort of a back of the envelope exercise where you're working through these questions yourself. You can do that too. But after ideating, right, there's a point where we have to get to action. And so, in nonprofits, we're often building the plane while flying. And, sometimes our dazzling ideas may or may not work. So we have to find out. And what we can do is design small experiments, learn and adjust before we grow and scale our idea. So there's a great story of experimentation from a nonprofit called World Reader. World Reader is a nonprofit with a mission to bring digital books to disadvantaged children and their families. So when World Reader launched back in 2010, they began several experiments at the same time. In one experiment, they gave Kindle e-reader machines or tablets, like you see in the picture, to a small group of elementary students in Ghana. But what they found was that when the children would play during recess, the devices kept breaking. But at the same time, their team was experimenting with a mobile app, which they learned from observation over time that the young users actually much preferred. So today, about 200,000 users a month are reading books on the mobile platform. So I think there's a few good lessons here. One is World Reader was really smart to spread their bets. If they would have gone all in on the Kindle e-reader, which they actually were pretty excited about, if they would have invested everything on that program, they may have never discovered the better solution with the mobile app. So there are arguments that it can be far better to fail fast and fail small before investing too big. And experimentation can help us learn and innovate. But we have to build in some expectations and toleration for failure when we do that. So it's really important for leaders and organizations to have the right attitude towards risk and failure. And there's a story that I really love related to this from the Hewlett Foundation. So the Hewlett Foundation offers a prize to their grant-making officers they encourage them to share what they call the worst grant from which you learned the most. And I think that's so great. And then they have these sort of fun gatherings where there's no pressure, just to sort of share, like, yeah, this one was kind of a dud. Here's what I was thinking at the time. Here's what we learned. I think that's really great, right? It kind of takes the pressure off and allows us to be honest and laugh at ourselves. And where I work at Mercatus, I'm really thankful that we do have a board of directors with that kind of spirit. And they do encourage us to take risks and experiment and understand that there will be failure. They tell us it's okay to fail as long as we're learning and adjusting. And so based on this then, based on kind of, we get clarity about our thinking, we start designing experiments, sometimes we fail, but we're gonna learn what works and what doesn't work, and that's gonna help us get clarity about that, and our vision and our strategy are gonna come into sharper focus. So now we're gonna shift a little bit into part 2 of the book. So in the middle part of the book, it's asking, how do we build an ecosystem for everyday innovation so that it's just a normal part of our daily work? So I'm going to shift gears now. We've been talking about ideation, which is so much fun, right? And this might seem a little bit less sexy to talk about kind of systems and processes, but if you're a systems nerd like me, then you're going to like this part. So think about the many things that feed into a workplace culture. So there's things like what's going to hold us accountable? What do our metrics look like? What are the nuances of the donor-partner relationship that might trickle into how we operate? What is our workplace culture like? How are people either collaborating or maybe not collaborating with each other? And what's our internal decision-making process? Who in the organization is making decisions, and what does that authority system look like, and why? Are we bottom-up? Are we top-down? So how we design our workplace systems can incentivize and encourage innovation, or if they're designed poorly, it can squash innovation. So I think what's helpful, this diagram's in the book, but I think it's really helpful to see and think about it this way, that there are competing needs and goals in the workplace, and we have to find a way to strike the right balance. There's a famous economist who said there are no solutions, only trade-offs. I know that's a little bit of a bummer, but I think there's wisdom in that. And so I really like this story from the Mayo Clinic of how they balanced that, how they thought through, on the one hand, we want creativity and empowerment, of course, but then organizations are large, right? And so you have to manage complexity. Sometimes you need a little bit of bureaucracy, but so how do you find that kind of path through the middle that's right for your organization? So I like this story from Mayo Clinic. Mayo Clinic's probably the best nonprofit hospital in the world, and they're famous for finding innovative solutions for people who are very sick. And the reputation didn't happen by accident. In interviews, team members at Mayo say that good patient outcomes are because they're empowered to carry out their organizational values. One value is the needs of the patient come first, and another value is unsurpassed collaboration. And they seem to truly live this. So then team members are intentionally trained, empowered, and encouraged to put those values into practice. So I'm going to quote now from a Mayo Clinic staff member who said, "If the employee's choices are either getting back to work on time or taking 10 minutes to get a wheelchair for a patient who seems unsteady, the patient will get the wheelchair." And I think that's wonderful. And that is bottom-up empowerment, how these values became part of their workplace culture, guiding all decisions, big or small. And that's intentional. In another story at Mayo Clinic, the night staff were concerned for how noise can affect a patient's sleep, which is, as we know, very important for the healing process. And so this night staff team came up with the idea to start conducting noise studies. And this led eventually to designing quieter flooring, quieter wheels on food carts, and lower decibels for overhead paging. So this second section of the book is really about stories like that. So how do we navigate between the complexities of, this is organizational design, basically how we think through these complexities, think through these trade-offs, and then intentionally design processes and systems that don't squash workplace innovation, but help it. So I'm moving along quickly as I promise time for Q&A. So the last section of the book is where it gets personal. It's really asking the question, what does it mean to bring your personal innovation A game? And it invites a lot of personal self-reflection. So I asked as I was researching the book, are there traits of nonprofit innovators and social entrepreneurs that we can learn from? Like, are these kind of nonprofit superstars born with it, or is there encouragement for all of us and that we can maybe learn these things ourselves? And I found it's the latter. We can learn these things. So, social entrepreneurs have some things in common. They're fearless and relentless problem solvers. And I suspect that probably is relevant to a lot of you who are doing that in your work. They boldly challenge the status quo. They're very good at persuading others. And the good news is, we can learn from these things. We can do these things ourselves. So there's 3 chapters in this last section, and one of them is about how nonprofit innovators learn to be persuasive. So if you think about your own experience working in your nonprofit, if you have an idea, you know that you have to convince a lot of people that your good idea is worth pursuing. Because you want to stand out from, everybody's got great ideas, so you need your good idea to stand out. And we need resources, so then we have to convince our colleagues, our boss, our donors. You might have to convince superstar talent to come work for your nonprofit. And you think about grant makers who might get 100 applications but can only fund, say, 5. So we have to be really persuasive. And there's a chapter with lots of stories and examples of people doing that really well. One of the stories was about how a team member at a wildlife conservation nonprofit in South Africa proposed a really far-out, gutsy idea for saving an endangered herd of rhinos. And so the book goes into what that persuasion looked like. And they had a really good outcome from that. I was also, funny story, I was surprised to learn how Mother Teresa and Fred Rogers, who of course we know had great ideas, were very often told no. So they were unknowns at one point, right? So I kind of laugh when I think about that. Can you imagine being the one to get to the pearly gates and say, yeah, that was me. I'm the one who told Mother Teresa her idea was terrible. So there's lessons in that for us, right? We have to, of course, we have to learn to be very, very persuasive, dust ourselves off, keep trying. And so then one other chapter in this part of the book is called What's Your Superpower? And the economists that I work with would call it finding your comparative advantage, but I thought what's your superpower is probably a little more appealing language. But knowing your superpower or your skills or your passion can then really help you focus and confidently say no to things and help you contribute, right, as an innovator. So there's lots of questions in that chapter for self-reflection. And then the last chapter in that section is courage, diplomacy, and curiosity, which are traits that are really needed for innovation. So I promised to leave time for Q&A, so I'm going to stop the presentation portion. But I'll just say that if you or someone you know is involved in the great work of social change, the book is available here. It's available at all major retailers, and I have a blog, and you can find me on social media as well. So thank you very much for your time, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
So we'll now have time for Q&A. If you have a question, raise your hand and wait for the speaker to call on you, and then also the mic, wait for the mic so we can catch it on the live stream as well.
My question is, what are some of the most effective strategies that maybe you found in your research as far as building a coalition or building a partnership? Because you talked a little bit about that and organizations working together and they might not have all of the same beliefs. And I'm just interested if you found any keys or important nuggets that are valuable if you're looking to try to build strong partnerships.
Yeah, there were a lot of stories in the book with examples of organizations that did it. Really great, stories that were inspiring. So yeah, there was one was a community in New Orleans that was destroyed by Hurricane Katrina, and their neighborhood was slotted to be bulldozed. And they were going to fight back, and they brought all sorts of stakeholders together, a lot local, some churches, some businesses, and even the Kennedy School of Government from, out of state. And there are other stories like the Elizabeth River Project that brought together they were cleaning up the Chesapeake Bay, and likewise, right, brought together like business, government. So that's encouraging that that's happening, because I think for any big, wicked problem, complex problem, like we have to, right? I don't think we really have a choice. Like Mercatus recently sponsored a conference on ocean health and the problem of overfishing. Likewise, right, we brought in like all those, it's hard, like if you're doing that kind of work, you know that that's not easy. So I don't know if this will be a rocket science type answer, but because Mercatus does a lot of that, we just usually start by making first going through all those thought exercises, right? Being really clear first about like, what is the thing we're trying to achieve, and are we clear about it? Have we really stress tested our thinking? There's also a step in there where we kind of go through we stress test our thinking about, is this a battle we can even win? Like if it's, some problems are just so big. So there's an exercise in the book that kind of helps you think through that. And I use the example of curbing teen smoking back in the 1950s. It's kind of it's shocking now for at least me at my age to look back at that time and just see like Hollywood was not, they were not on the side of like curbing teen smoking. So like groups that you might think would be your allies, maybe are, maybe aren't. So kind of going through all those, I don't know if this is helpful, right? But going through a lot of those thought exercises. And then you start inviting people or trying to build those relationships, So like with our Mercatus conference that we did on ocean health, there were people who were not into our mission. We're economists, take a market-oriented approach usually to solving social problems. And there were professors who came who were like, I don't like your mission, but I'll hear you out, right? And so we kind of used a pluralism approach, a civil discourse, like, hey, we recognize not everybody here, we're not going to see eye to eye. So we had a 2-day conference, and you could see that tension at the start of the day, but through the process of group thought exercises and collaboration, by the end of the day, you could see visibly people were like, well, I'm still not in love with your beliefs, but I see that we're, collaboratively, we have some shared goals here, and we're going to try to figure this out. So I don't know if that answers your question very well, but that's been my experience with. In the front. Is there a microphone?
Thank you so much for your presentation. It's wonderful. And one of the things that you discussed that I was wondering if you had more thoughts on are, one of the great things about the private sector is you have things like prices, and you have that sort of profit and loss accounting you can do. This is one of the things that you don't have, or at least you don't have as fine-grained as you do in the nonprofit world. And we often try to replace those with metrics. And I'm wondering if you could point to some of the worst metrics you've ever seen and some of the best, and like what's the difference there, and what in your experience at Mercatus and looking at these other organizations, like, do you see as like, metrics that are really helpful for organizations, and which do you see, driving them off track?
That's great. I love that question. Yeah, a lot of my work for probably the first 8 or so years at Mercatus was just metrics, working with teams on. They actually originally hired me because they needed someone to help their teams get ready for our annual board meeting. And they're like, our whole organization shuts down for like 3 months before the board meeting. It's chaos, and everyone's like looking for Excel sheets on their computer hard drives. It's terrible, and we like your background. Maybe you could come in and like work with our teams. So I started out helping each team think through metrics, but really quickly realized like we have to get the strategy thinking down first to know like what did it be really clear. Otherwise, you're just kind of doing metrics for the sake of metrics and measuring tactics, and it's just not really that helpful. I could literally talk for an hour and a half about your question, so I'm going to try to. So there is a chapter in the book on metrics. It's after the strategy chapters, right? So I start out in the chapter with, there's this great book that I recommend to anyone. It's called The Tyranny of Metrics. It's like a 4-hour read, and the author did a fantastic job. He uses kind of a foil. He uses HBO's The Wire, so stories from the police and the school system. It's fun read, like it's kind of entertaining, and he's just kind of unpacking like these are all the ways that metrics can be disastrous. Don't do these things. And so it could be like incentivizing the wrong thing or measuring the wrong thing. He does a brilliant job laying all that out. My only kind of complaint about the book is he never gets to, well, how can metrics help us? So that's important too. So the way I lay out the book is help your teams recognize those bad things that we don't want to do. Talk openly about it. And I think a lot of times in nonprofits, teams feel like, oh, I can't say anything, or our donors are insisting we do this. I can't really speak up. But I don't think that's true. I think that teams doing the work should be empowered because they have the local knowledge. They're on the front lines doing the work. So first, empower your teams to call out those bad metrics when they see them. And so then that leads you to the question of, well, what are they supposed to do for us? And so, we can't just wink at our donors and say, trust us, right? And we also want to hold ourselves accountable, and we need to use the same yardstick. So even if it's something as simple as this isn't a program strategy, but think about my individual performance agreement each year, like my job description. I work through it. It's almost like a mini strategy just for me. So I work through it, I articulate, here's what I hope to achieve. I get buy-in from my supervisors. So we're using the same yardstick. And I think it's the same, right, when grantees or donors are, hopefully there's some discussion so that we're starting, right, with agreement about, well, what does good look like? And so then there's a very important, I think the most important question we're trying to answer is, how do we know if what we're doing is working? And so I know I promised a short answer. I'm not holding to my promise, but so it's always strategy-based. And so for Mercatus, for example, I have these handouts we've developed over the years of what would a menu of metrics look like for this type of programming? What would it look like for that type of program? So it's always kind of based on the strategy. And then we usually have options you can choose from, like good to better to best. The best are going to be more of the outcome-based. The harder, the more expensive metrics. So hope that's helpful. Any other questions? In the back.
I've worked in the private sector and the public sector. I've noticed a huge difference between organizations in their organizational structure, both formal and informal. I'm wondering if you notice a pattern there and how a board of directors maybe directly interacts or doesn't interact with staff or the executives or the public.
Wow, that's a great question. Yeah, I guess most of my experience no, I take that back. So the first 7 years of my life was in the for-profit world. I was early career, so I wasn't at the board level or anything. I did experience a little bit of government when I was in the Peace Corps, but for the most part, I've been working in the nonprofit sector. So I don't know if I could speak very well to those other sectors, but I think you raise a really good point, right? They operate differently. Their incentives are different. I think in government, they've got a hard way to go because they have very few levers. They don't have that much freedom. I think we at a nonprofit have far more freedom, to operate and hire who we think is best and design our programs, where I think government is often constrained, and they're maybe under a congressional oversight board or something like that. So I think they have less leeway. But I know I'm meandering a little bit. I'm not sure if I'm answering. Would you want to add to your question, or I want to be helpful?
Just a small part. So I talked to a university professor before, and his board of directors interacts directly with him and evaluates his performance, but doesn't interact, and he doesn't allow them to interact with any other staff members, anything like that. And I've seen that operate differently in different organizations and how much control a board of directors has or how much interaction the executives have with them. And I'm just curious if there were any patterns of success in that specific aspect.
Yeah, I feel lucky, so because I've often been the person preparing our annual board report for our board members for our annual board meeting. I'll just speak from Mercatus's example, but I feel like we have a pretty great board of directors, and as I mentioned, they tell us it's okay to experiment, it's okay to fail, right? Just tell us how you're learning from that, and they're very high level. I had heard horror stories from other organizations, where board members coming in and choosing the carpet color or something like that, but our board, I feel like it works pretty well for us. They keep it very high level, very strategic. They ask us hard questions, and they have kind of that, bird's eye view of things we may miss, even though we're all thinking very, very hard every day about our strategies, but they've pointed out things like, hey, this is fantastic. You guys should scale this, right? And it didn't even enter our minds. So I think that's a high-functioning board experience from what I've seen, but I know it can also go the other way. Any other questions? In the front here.
So where does mission play into all of this? As far as successful folks are incredibly well tied to their mission, or maybe even change their mission over time. Their mission, they realize, has moved, and they're honest enough to, I don't know if you've ever seen an example where they actually changed their mission. Speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, so this might be related. I ran across a lot of startup stories, like origin stories, pulling together some of these case studies, and they're like big nonprofits we've all heard of now, like Habitat for Humanity, Mayo Clinic, and their origin stories were really cool. Civil rights movement. And so a lot of them started out small without really having clarity about their mission quite yet. So they're sort of in the startup phase where they have very few resources, but maybe some passionate founders. They have a sense of the problem they want to solve. They're not quite sure how they're going to solve it. So like Alcoholics Anonymous, a couple of gentlemen got together who were both alcoholics, and just through the process of having a conversation realized that two alcoholics talking to each other can actually help with sobriety. That's all they knew, right? But they knew we're onto something, we've helped each other find sobriety, let's see if we can help others. But they were really fuzzy about how to do it. They didn't have their mission figured out. They didn't even realize for a long time that how helpful it would be to be anonymous, right? They had to learn that, and eventually over time they found their 12-step model and kind of came to their mission. So I think there's an early on phase for startups where they do have certainty about the problem they want to solve, but they just have to figure it out sort of for a while through trial and error. And then eventually they find it. They find their business model. They find kind of their differentiator, their mission, their theory of change. And once they become confident in that, then I think that startup phase is sort of, that mission probably isn't going to change very often, but it may, like maybe it's more like every couple decades or something, right? It's going to be a slower pace of change. But programmatically, I think that kind of constant iteration, constant experimentation changes a lot more rapidly, right? So you've got kind of more of a fixed North Star with your mission, and then kind of like rapid experimentation, and you're just trying things at the program level. So yeah, it is though important that you give a hard look at your mission from time to time and make sure you're not being path dependent and maybe missing things. The landscape changes around you. Like where I work at Mercatus, we were like 5 or 6 years ago when we started seeing all this kind of polarization, and it might seem weird that we're economists and working on pluralism. Like, what does that have to do with economics? But it was really through the course of these kind of mission conversations where like, we can't not pay attention to this. Like, markets won't function if society doesn't have social trust. We have to start designing some social programming around this. And is it mission creep? We don't think so, right? We had really robust debates about that. So yeah, I don't know if that helps, but that's been my experience with an organization kind of, our mission still is basically the same, but we're moving in new directions, and I think that's the right thing. Sal.
So Leah, you do a great job in your book talking about risk. And you remind us that to be successful in innovation involves risk-taking. When you had the impediments up on the screen earlier, the one that caught my attention most was the politics of self-preservation.
Yeah.
So here's where I'm going with that. I'm thinking organization can be great, have great processes, systems, personnel, all that, but all that can be just erased if the leadership is in self-preservation mode, which we know kills risk-taking and then is an impediment to innovation. What, if anything, can we do about this? I'm noticing more and more of it. I don't know what's going on out there, but is there anything we can do about that?
Yeah, I think that's really important. So like in the design thinking that I was showing you, when you get to that what's feasible, if you read that chapter in the book, right, risk is a part of like surfacing risk and obstacles. And so as an internal consultant, I make sure to do that when I'm working with our program teams, because if I don't hear them talking about it, and often you just don't, because people are just, they're very immersed in kind of, we all are, right? We're immersed in our rabbit holes and our kind of work that we feel, is very important. And so we don't always take the time to ask those tough, uncomfortable feasibility questions. And that's so important to do. And to underscore what you're saying, like we have a fundraising team of maybe like 10 people, and our head grant writer has said to me, the biggest problem I see in proposals is no one talking about risk at all. And that looks so bad. I mean, it makes us look like either we pretend they don't exist, we don't know they exist, which is terrible, So I think it's really productive, and it's some of the most strategic thinking you can do when you sit down with the teams. What would make this program fail? Like the what's feasible exercise with the Miranda Priestley character. Ask those hard questions, and you're going to impress your donors when you do that. You're going to show that you're doing the hardest thinking of all, and usually through doing that, you'll find your differentiator, and if you haven't already, right? That's going to draw that out. There was a great example in the book of a nonprofit that worked with at-risk youth, and I included their proposal for a grant proposal, and they were really explicit about, our work is hard. We might actually have to call a young person in Baltimore 100 times before they'll come to our programming. It's that hard, right? So they're not trying to hide it. They're like, this is what sets us apart, right? And it's really compelling. And I think they're impress their stakeholders and their grant makers by being so explicit about the realities of their work. So I love that question. It's really important. Do we have in the back?
Just to follow up on that, so most nonprofits, like you said, their mission is revolved around solving a problem. So what happens when they accomplish that and it's no longer a problem, or not at the level that needs all the funding and all the programs because they have solved the problem?
Yeah.
What happens then?
Have a party, celebrate.
But what do you do as an organization?
Yeah,
do you
yeah.
disband? Do you change your mission? Do you?
Yeah, I've ran across some examples of that. There was I'm fuzzy on the details, but there was an organization that was helping victims of the Holocaust. And they were helping them just with, different needs like housing, and they aged out eventually, right? And so this nonprofit ended up just kind of completely transforming and really downshifting and just shifting to a completely different model that would eventually completely dissolve. So yeah, I think it happens, and it's important for us to always be putting our resources to their highest and best value use. So. I think there are times where there's a mission accomplished, and it's appropriate to shift in some way, whether that means completely closing or just coming up with a new model. Question of Todd.
Hi, Leah. It's great to see this as a product of all these works, and having been there at the beginning where we first had these discussions on many of these ideas. So what I'm curious about is a lot of this are things that you've thought about, that you've applied over the years. As you did the research for this book, what did you find that really surprised you, that was unexpected, and then you've gone and taken and said, this is a great idea, I've never thought about this before, but now I need to apply it in what I'm doing?
Yeah, there were definitely surprises. So one was, I always had this envy of the for-profit world. Someone asked the great question about, the differences between like the for-profit world and nonprofits. And I always thought, they're so lucky because they have all this like hard data, and they're very quantitative, and they have things like profit and inventory and prices. And we in nonprofits, we're talking in terms of outcomes, and it's very fuzzy. And I was interviewing an econ scholar at George Mason, and he teaches theory of the firm, and he was like, look, it's actually not all like roses and sunshine. They still have to interpret that data, and that's fuzzy, right? So that came as, it just made me feel a little bit better about, it's tough for them too. It's not like they just see their data and just automatically know, right? There's some they have to discern wisely about what that information needs. So that was a good little lesson for me.
Time for one last question.
Oh, in the back.
What advice? Thank you for being here. You've done a terrific job. Really appreciate you being here and sharing. The tiny nonprofit, the 1 or 2 person nonprofit, swimming in a world of nonprofits that have scores and scores of employees and resources and grants and universities and the like. What hope for innovation for social change is there for the tiniest of the tiny?
Yeah, I don't know. I probably didn't mention. My role at Mercatus, about half my time is set aside to help our internal teams. And I think we're a large 200-person organization. But the other half of my time is set aside to help a lot of startups. And so there are all sorts of kind of startup university centers where it might be just like one professor or one assistant who's helping them. And they're trying to launch. They want to be more like us, right? We've been around 40 years. We're large. And they're like, hey, we're just starting, can you help? So the other half of my time is set aside, like I'll offer a lot of the same workshops and consulting help to them. And yeah, it's different, it's hard. So many risks, very high risk, because you don't have donor diversification yet. And if that one founder leaves, it might fold, right? So very high risk. Not a lot of resources. And so, but the nice thing, I guess I wrote this book with them a lot in my mind, because thought exercises, like I mentioned, like you can do these as back of the envelope, right? So that one person, that founder, can go through some of these thought exercises and we've done this a lot, really build a compelling mission that then becomes kind of the foundation for attracting and hiring people and sharing it with your dean or your possible donors, right? So it doesn't take a budget, right, to just be very thoughtful, or maybe bring an advisory board together to really stress test that thinking and figure out what your mission's all about. So there are things, but I also want to acknowledge there are all sorts of high risks, and it's tough because that founder's wearing so many hats, and I respect what they're doing. It's hard. So I hope that the book is a resource to people of small sized nonprofits as well. So I think we're out of time.
Thank you, Leah. Please give her a round of applause.
Thanks.
Thank you so much for coming and sharing your wisdom. The books are for sale here next to the doorway, so please grab one of those. West Michigan has such a rich history of nonprofits and service to the community, so we hope you take this. If this book isn't for you, maybe you know someone who it's for, so please grab one and enjoy your time this afternoon. Two quick announcements. Please leave your name tags and your program review for us at the back. We would appreciate that. And then November 3rd, we do have our last ALS for the year Acton Lecture Series in accordance with our research conference that's going on the very same day. It talks about the engagement of, a lot of people talk about economics starting with Adam Smith, but this is a very strong economic conference talking about some economic principles starting with Aquinas and engaging the Catholic social thought and engagement with economics. And so please come and hear a phenomenal lecturer from Notre Dame on November 3rd. And then lastly, parking. Those of you in the back of the building, that parking spot, please, is reserved for handicapped or people with who have a hard ability to walk. So in the future, if you could park along the streets or at the library, that would help us with the very back parking lot for access for those who need it. So thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.